But before we get into that detail, I'd like to give you just a little bit of an overview. So if we could click, I think one slide, there you go. That's me. This is you're in the introduction. And if you click one more time for me, Matt. So first, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the overall recycling access in Mason County. And we're really talking about residential recycling. I think almost all of this presentation is talking about recycling we have available to us in households. So in terms of recycling county, you've got curbside collection in the city of Ludington, the city of Scottville, and Pere Marquette Township, and drop off in Hamlin Township and Summit Township. Now, what the common factor in all of those is that you have the local governments who are contracting with haulers for that service. And what it's really doing is that, and I didn't live here when all of this started. I'm new to Mason County, about 2 years. But what you'll find is there's a really strong connection between the fact that those communities, those cities and townships were already involved in helping their residents manage their solid waste. So we have, for example, in Ludington, curbside collection of solid waste. The city contracts with Republic for that. So that's a service we have as city residents. And they added on to that contract for curbside collection of solid waste. So you see a strong relationship between the local government's involvement in solid waste management overall and their involvement in recycling. That's even really evident in the 2 drop-off locations, because transfer stations, which is where if you live in a rural area and don't have curbside collection of your garbage, that you take your solid waste to the transfer station. And these are the only 2 transfer stations that are run by local governments in the county, Hamlin Township and Summit Township. So again, they've, as a part of their transfer station, is also offered drop-off of recyclables. So if you live in another jurisdiction in Mason County and you don't have recycling services, you probably don't also have solid waste services. You're likely living in a township where you have to contract independently with a hauler or go to a private transfer station for that. So these are the communities, the local governments that have chosen to provide recycling services to their residents. They collect almost about the same things, and Matt's going to cover a lot more about what is collected in these recycling services when I bring him on board. But before I do that, I just want to cover one more thing. If you could give me another click, Matt. There is legislation that's been pending in Michigan. They tried to pass this legislation last year, but were not able to get to it. I'm pretty sure the legislature was working on other things that would actually set recycling goals for the entire state. These would only be goals. The state can't mandate local governments provide recycling services, so that's a local government decision. But there are goals for local governments to aspire to. They're based on population. So for Ludington and Mason County, these would be the goals that we would be expected to adopt as a part of our solid waste plan for the county. And that's by January of 2028, that municipalities greater than 5,000, and that's Ludington. Ludington is the only one that meets that 90% of its single family dwellings have access to curbside recycling for at least one material collected twice a month. So we've got more materials than one right now, but we're monthly in Ludington, so we would not be meeting that goal right now. And then by 2032, for counties under 100,000, and again, that's Mason County, if you're in an area without curbside recycling, the goal would be to have at least one drop-off location for every 10,000 residents available at least 24 hours a month. And even though I haven't really done the analysis, I'm pretty sure we're almost there right now with that, other than there are certainly areas that do not have access to drop off. The Hamlin Township facility is available to anyone in the county for a fee. In fact, it's fee-based overall. You have to pay $20 if you're a resident of Hamlin Township to drop off your recyclables, $20 a year. And if you're outside of Hamlin Township, it's $100. Summit Township's drop-off is residents only, and that's an attended facility, and they enforce that. So you cannot sneak your recyclables into Summit Township. So that should give you some perspective about what would happen, about if this law were to pass, which we're hoping it will. One of the real benefits of this legislation that's pending is it's moving the entire state from focusing on solid waste as just solid waste and recyclables, but looking at it as an overall materials management plan. So that's something that we at a few are monitoring, and if that legislation passes, we'll look for ways to make sure that we get the most out of it for the residents of Mason County. in meeting those new goals. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Matt, who is your primary presenter. And Matt is the Municipal Services Manager for Northern Michigan for Republic Services. And he works closely with local government to help implement solid waste recycling services and other programs for business and residents. He's been working in solid waste and recycling industry for the last 13 years with experience in recycling processing facilities, hauling, and contracted services. As I mentioned, Ludington, Scottville, Pere Marquette, all contract with Republic. Matt has served on the board of the Michigan Recycling Coalition for 8 years and serves on several county solid waste planning committees. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt for most of our content tonight.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I really appreciate that introduction. As Sharon said, my name is Matt Violette. I'm the Municipal Services Manager here in Northern Michigan for Republic Services. And what that means is I deal primarily with governmental entities like Pere Marquette, Ludington, Scottville, Manistee, and all of those communities that do have that contracted services that Sharon mentioned earlier. Most communities where you see curbside services across the state are in what they call an organized collection program. And that's where the municipality has made the decision to contract with one provider on behalf of its residents to provide a multitude of services. And that traditionally involves solid waste, recycling, sometimes yard waste, and sometimes some other products. So that's typically how you see curbside as it relates in residential communities. I always say residents have the power to motivate their local governments to do those kind of things. And if enough people ask that question, it's something that they can always go out and do an RFP for and at least get the information and then make the decision if it makes sense for the township or not. But they won't do that unless you ask for it. So it's really driven by you, the residents. And so I encourage you to take the power in your hands to do that. Tonight, I'm going to give you kind of an overview presentation of some recycling information that will hopefully help wow and ooh and awe you. Not that recycling ever does, but hey, we'll give it a shot, right, folks? But at the least, you'll come away from it probably a little more knowledgeable on what's going on globally and locally. And so I appreciate your time tonight. And as Mrs. Kane said, go ahead and put your comments in the chat feature as you think of them. That way you don't forget about it. And we can answer them as we get to the end, and we will try to answer all of your questions. So I want to talk a little bit real first about what the recycling markets look like as it relates to where we are today compared to where we were. And so this slide's a little dated, but I think it shows it, pretty nicely. So if you look at the top left, newspaper and magazines have really all trended to digital. There's still publications that do that, but the vast majority of what used to be out there in print media has really transferred. Even in the junk mail that you get at home nowadays, that has really gone way down, especially during COVID when they realized you weren't going to the stores. That junk mail decreased even more because people weren't using those coupons. They weren't going out and buying things. So you saw a lot of that stop. You've seen some trends in plastics like the Tide bottle, the traditional Tide bottle, which is HDPE, has changed to Tide Pods, and now it's really in a flexible packaging. It's in like a Ziploc bag a lot of times as well. It's what they call flexible packaging. And so HDPE was a very good plastic. It was a high value plastic. It generated some money for the recyclers when they processed it. This Tide Pod container that you see here is actually an off-spec PET. PET is the same material used in a water bottle, but when you put a color in it, it becomes a very limited required resource and doesn't have much value for it. So when that manufacturer, Tide in this example, went from the HDPE kind of Tide bottle to this pods material and went to this different packaging model, the packaging was most likely way cheaper for them. But on the backside, it also has way less value when it gets to the recycle center for them to process and actually generate some revenue for. The water bottle, if you look at that's the same way. This is one of my favorite examples. In 2000, it took 48,000 individual water bottles to equal 1 ton of weight. If you look at just 15 years down the road, It took then 92,000 water bottles to equal that same weight of 1 ton. So a processor has to process twice as many bottles in order to equal the same weight. And that's what they sell that off-spec product for at a recycle center. And that's how the revenue is generated. The last thing there at the bottom really talks about how the commodity values have continued to slide. Corrugated cardboard and paper have continued to slide over the last few years, last 15. And what that effect does. So if you wrap all of that up into a cohesive statement, what that looks like is there's less value on the back end of recycling, which means there's more cost on the front end when it looks at your house and what your municipality is paying or what your transfer center is paying to get that material collected and processed. So Republic Services in many areas of the country has processing facilities as well. And I've worked at some of those, and so I'm familiar with that. So there's a slide that we're going to get to that's going to talk to that here in a minute, but I'm going to bring you through a couple more things first. China sword was kind of a big thing, and you might have heard this before, and so I want to spend just a minute on it. But in 2017, China introduced this concept of we're going to stop taking material, and we're going to put much higher restrictions on the material that we do take. And when you got into 2018, China started banning imported materials from the United States and other first world countries, because what they were getting was a bale of paper that had 40 or 50% contaminants in it. And they decided that they didn't want to deal with that within their country. And so they started enforcing these rules and ultimately got to the point where they really strongly discouraged material coming and ultimately got to a ban. So at one point in time, 40% of all the material that was collected in the United States was shipped into China to be processed. And that was really effective for us because China was shipping a lot of container ships over here with products on them. And we'd refill those containers with recyclables and ship them back into China. And they would then process that recycling material back into raw goods that they would remake products out of and ship back to us. And it was kind of an ebb and flow, went back and forth. But the Chinese government kind of changed that around. And this particular slide is probably a little hard to see depending on your screen, especially if you're on a mobile phone. But if you look on the left, you'll see China here as the second item down. And this talks about the tons. This is the global river of plastic that transferred around the United States and into other countries. So if you look at these big veins, that's the material that was coming out of the US going into China and Hong Kong. And then all these little veins were kind of these other countries that were processing material: Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, Turkey, Thailand, Asia, and some of these other places. And so after that 2018 change in China, you see those big veins going to China change dramatically. And some of those veins went to other countries. But what also happened at that point in time is some of these big mills from the other countries started investing in the United States to where they would start processing that material here in the US, turn it into the raw good, and then ship the raw good back over to China because it was so restrictive to ship back just baled recycling. So you think of that Tide bottle, they take all those Tide bottles and they sort them out by product and they bale it. And when they do that, they put that in a bale and they put 30 or 50 of those bales in a container, and that container goes to China. They then grind that, wash it, pelletize it, then take those pellets and turn it back into a product. Well, during this China change, that all started happening here in the US, which is fantastic for the US economy because having more domestic mills closer to us gives us a little higher value and a little bit different supply and demand chain. So I just wanted to talk through that real quick so you guys, anyone who had questions on China and how recycling works and how you get money out of it and all of that kind of makes sense. This talks about that same shift, 2017 to 2018. So if you look at 2017, plastics, aluminum, steel, mixed plastics, mixed paper, corrugated containers, here on the left, 64% of the recycling material created a reasonable return in value for the processors. Jump to 2018, only 35% of that material then created a reasonable return for the processors. And so the normal supply and demand theories in play means the less things that have value means the higher cost it is to process that stuff. And so I just like to show this, and that 35's kind of carried back into the 45-50 now. So that's an ebb and flow based on what's going on in the economies and in the supply and demand chain. This is what's the most important to understand about recycling. There's really four.
Matt, we can't hear you. Matt.
Raise your hand.
Matt. We can't hear you.
I wonder what happened.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. So I'll kind of start back at the beginning of this slide. I don't know where you lost me. The collection, the truck driving around, the fuel, the driver, the equipment costs, all of that's the collection. That's what happens at the curb or at the transfer station. Then you have the processing. That's what happens at the processing facilities where the truck brings that material. They bring that up a conveyor line. They sort all that material into like commodities. They bale it, and then they ship it off to a mill. That's what's called processing. The residual is all the garbage that's in your recycling. That's your dirty pizza boxes. That's your styrofoam. That's the things that aren't supposed to be there that are there. And I want to pause there for just a second. So when you go back to the 70s and you look at recycling, recycling was really 10 things, right? It was really simple. It was really easy. And it was not very complex. You jump into where we are today, and everybody believes that everything is recyclable. You know, and I like to show this as an example. I've got this little happy light that sits next to my desk. It's a piece of electronics. It lights up at night. It's got an LED bulb in it. It's pretty weighted, but it's plastic. And so, hey, it's plastic. It's recyclable. I'm going to throw it in my bin at the curb. It's not recyclable. When you do that, this happy light becomes unhappy, and it ends up in the trash because the recycle center that processes your recycling does not process electronic waste. They also don't process propane tanks. They also don't process steel cable and lawnmower blades. They don't process wood. They don't process styrofoam. And so there's a lot of don'ts in recycling today because everyone believes that so many things are recyclable when they're really not. And so what I like to tell people when you think about recycling is if it has a neck on it, if it's a bottle and it has a neck on it, it's recyclable. If it's a tub, a butter tub, some sort of a plastic tub, it's recyclable. If it's plastic outside of that, it's a pretty good chance it's not recyclable in your core recycling at the curb. And so that's the kind of the plastic trick that I use people. So there's all this residual, there are all these happy lights that become unhappy in the recycling and become garbage. And so that's the residual. So there's a cost for collection, there's a cost to process, there's a cost to throw away the residuals, and then there's a value of the commodities. So you add up the three costs, you subtract the commodity values, and that's what your total cost of recycling is. So the more contamination you have in your recycling in your community, the higher your costs are. The further away from the processing center you are, the higher your costs are because that truck's got to drive farther to bring that material there. The higher the processing center costs are because maybe they're not an upgraded or a fully automated facility, the higher costs you are. And so all of those things tie into what that cost is at the curb. And I know a lot of people like to ask that question. So I like to spend the first couple of minutes talking about that. So this is a slide that talks about really what's easily recyclable and what's not. So again, paper and cardboard, metal cans. Metal cans don't mean lawnmower blades or steel cables. It means metal cans. That's what the recycle center is looking for. A lot of people believe that, metal is universally recyclable, and so therefore they should put it in there. But at a processing center, what you have is what they call is a eddy current that takes everything that has a magnetic value for it and it sucks it up from the conveyor belt and shoots it off. Well, when you start putting items in there that are sharp, like lawnmower blades and saw blades, that becomes kind of harmful to the processing facility. Same thing with propane tanks. When you put a propane tank in there, if they don't catch it and they put it in their compactor ram, a small propane tank, one of the green ones, has a pretty big punch. A large propane tank, a white one, is equal to about a stick of dynamite when you stick it into a compactor and it explodes. It typically rocks the facility. It could break a $300,000 piece of equipment and has the tendency to injure people. So we try very hard to keep people from putting those kind of metal objects that aren't cans in your curbside recycling. Again, talk about anything with a neck when you talk about plastics. And then most importantly, that everything needs to be empty, clean, and dry. Another common thing that you see in recycling a lot of times are these things that are on your right. So plastic bags are not something that the recycling facilities take anymore. You can bring those back to your local Meijers, your Walmarts, your Targets. Any of your big box stores will take that stuff back. There's a lot of people that put soiled cups and things of that nature in their recycling. Half-drank McDonald's cups with still the ice and the water and stuff in them. Clothes are a big popular one still today. There's just a ton of people that put clothing in their recycle bin. Polystyrene and Styrofoam, we talked about already. 98% of the recycling programs in the country, in the United States, do not offer a polystyrene recycling program. There are very few, but not many, because it doesn't travel well. It breaks apart into little itty bitty pieces and little bitty balls, and it has no weight to it, and it's easily contaminated. And there's just all of these different reasons that at the curb, that doesn't work. Now there are, in the state of Michigan, Dart Container, who's a large styrofoam manufacturer, has multiple drop-offs across the state. They don't really have any up here in the north, but they do have some down in the rest of the state. So you can go on their website, dartcontainer.com, and look under recycling or sustainability, and they have a link that shows all those drop-off sites. Isabella County has one as an example that I can think of. Another big one is batteries. People believe that batteries are recycling at the curb and at their drop-off center, and they're really not. And in today's world, with nickel cads and lithium batteries, those are highly flammable batteries. And what happens is you get those into a recycle facility, and they have a tendency to start fires. And so they now have a product at the recycle centers. It's called a rover, and it is a thermal imaging camera that's got a fire hose hooked up to it. And it constantly monitors the pile of recycling for hot spots. And if it sees one, which is typically caused by a battery, it shoots water on that area of the recycling center so that it doesn't ignite into flames. Because when you imagine having all this paper and cardboard and plastic there, that's super flammable when you have big mountains and piles of that. So batteries are a big contender in today's world. We even get car batteries and boat batteries and some of those kind of batteries in recycle bins as well, especially the drop-offs. Toys are another one, just like the Happy Light. Everyone that thinks that I've got a McDonald's toy or a Little Tikes toy or any of these other plastic style toys is recyclable. But if you look at a toy, just like a Happy Light, there's multiple products inside that toy. There's the sprocket wheel, there's the plastic, there's maybe a magnet or something else inside of it, possibly a motor if it's a mechanized toy. So it's an item that has multiple layers to it, unlike a traditional plastic water jug, which has one layer to it. It's the plastic that it is. And then most importantly, never bag your recycling. Processing centers have to come up with some way to unbag your recycling whenever you bag it. And a lot of times they take that and they send it right down the road. Now, why I'm talking about bagged recycling, I also like to just pause for a minute and talk about shredded paper. Everybody loves to recycle paper because it's a core recyclable product. Paper in the shredded form, however, does not recycle at the curb or at a drop-off. what happens is when that processing facility starts sorting your material, the first sorting process that it goes to is called a fiber screen. And that fiber screen has star discs that move the fibers up, and the three-dimensional items drop through it. The three-dimensional items being your cans and bottles and things of that nature. What happens is there's also another screen underneath that that's called a fines. And so the fines lets all the really fine stuff, broken glass and shredded paper and dirt and stuff, fall through another layer, which basically goes off to be trash. So shredded paper, when put in a curbside recycling program, whether that's in a brown paper bag to contain it, or whether that's in a plastic bag, or whether that's just chucked in there, is 97% of the time going to end up as garbage. So I encourage you to use that as compostable material if you're a composter. I encourage you to use that as animal bedding if you have animals. I encourage you to use it to start fires like I do when I go to my property up north. So those are just some quick random things as we talk about the simple 1, 2, 3s of recycling. And I'm going to pause for just a second. So there's a couple expert tips here that the company likes to talk about again. And so some of that's always separate combined materials. So in this example at the top where you have this is probably a Matchbox car that's on a plastic sled with a piece of plastic in it. So you want to take that cardboard away from that piece of plastic. You don't want to keep those two materials attached because the plastic will end up going to the paper mill with that cardboard, and that will be considered contamination at the paper mill. The more contamination in a load, the less value that product has. Again, keep your recyclables clean and dry. If your container smells, it means it's contaminated. It means some things that's not supposed to be there is in there. If you've got a smelly recycle container, you're doing something wrong. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then when you start talking about plastics, if you can poke your finger through it, it's typically not recyclable. And then anything smaller with my screen, is that better? All right, sorry about that. I had this the other day too. I don't know why it's happening, so I apologize. So this last one here on the bottom to the right, anything smaller than a driver's license, an ID card, is likely to fall through the screens or could get jammed somewhere in the system. So you want to try to keep those things to a minimum. A lot of times, like pop bottle caps, what I recommend people doing is taking those and putting them inside a metal can and then pinching off the top of the can. That way all those little things stay in the bigger can. And when you recycle them, the eddy current pulls it up, chucks it all off to the side at once. Again, we talk about the kind of the no things here off to the far right, plastic bags and all of that again. That was me rolling through it kind of fast. And I don't want to skip anything, but I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. And so I want to make sure I answer any and all of those that you have tonight. So as I look through the chat here real quick, I'm going to rip back up towards the top and kind of go.
And Matt, I think I skipped one of my slides. So just to remind people that in Few's website,
top, Sharon actually put, it's when you put things in your recycle bin that don't belong there, you jeopardize the entire program. You're making a bad decision. There used to be a phrase that used to be, when in doubt, recycle it. And that phrase has kind of changed in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's when in doubt, put it somewhere else because it's likely not going to make it through. And so here's the interesting kind of thought process in that. When you put something in your recycle bin, so this happy light, when you send it to a landfill in your trash, if it's broken and you decide not to recycle it through electronics recycling, what happens is that happy light costs, we'll use hypothetical numbers here, costs about $50 a ton to make happy lights go away. When you put that happy light in your recycling, it costs about $110 a ton to make that happy light go through the recycling process and then ultimately end up in the landfill anyways, because a recycle center is not going to send that to an e-waste processor. They don't separate out electronic waste and send that to somewhere else. They just put it right in their, what they call their spoils or their residuals pile, their trash, and sends that down the road. So when you put something that doesn't belong in your recycling bin, it typically costs 3 times as much to make it go into the same place, which is the landfill, as if you would have just started that way. Does plastic bottles include water bottles? Absolutely. So again, anything with a neck, you're A-okay. Anything that's a tub, you're pretty much A-okay. Plastics, when you get into, your large Little Tikes toys and McDonald's toys and other plastics, Happy Lights, those kind of things, that's when plastics don't fit well. Wonder why Miles does not take plastic bottles. Okay, so plastic bottles. This is a loaded question. So for those of you that are paying attention from the bottling industry, please don't beat me up. Plastic bottles, as in water bottles, are non-carbonated beverages in the state of Michigan. Non-carbonated beverages do not require the DIME, the disposal law. So I like to touch base on that a minute because it's my happiest story in the world. So everyone that's older than 1970-ish will remember when the DIME began in the late 60s, early 70s. And we did a campaign that was called the Crying Indian. Probably not popular in today's sports teams renaming, but that's what it was at that point in time. And what the bottle bill was for the state of Michigan is really an anti-litter campaign, not a recycling campaign. There was a lot of pop cans and bottles alongside the highways in the state of Michigan, and they were trying to figure out a way to make that stop. And so that's where the deposit law, the DIME, came into effect with the Crying Indian. It's a great YouTube video. If you've never seen it, look it up. Michigan Bottle Ball Crying Indian, you'll find it. It's an oldie but a goodie. Let you know how far graphics have really come and how far television production has really come. So the bottle bill was really established by the bottling producers in the state of Michigan, and they fought very hard for it not to include wine, non-carbonated beverages, and some other things. And so today that holds true, that water is a non-carbonated beverage, and so therefore it does not have to have the bottle bill, does not have to have the DIME. And we could talk for an hour on the bottle bill. That's one of my favorite topics. The other part of that, and Sharon said this, is Myers doesn't want to be in the recycle business. That's a convenience that it provides as part of the bottle bill. They don't want to have to take all of those things back. That takes away square footage that they could be selling products. And it also requires, a very dedicated area for a very sticky and smelly product, ultimately, in a lot of times.
Yeah. Retailers fought very
hard. How do you dispose of batteries and electronics? So batteries and electronics in Mason County, the easiest way to do that is to save up your batteries and bring them to your household hazardous waste day. That's a very simple and economic way to do it. Electronics are a little more difficult. There are some different communities that do electronics recycling events in the north from time to time, and that's something that you can look up. If you look downstate into like the Grand Rapids market, they actually have retail stores from a company called Comp Renew, where you can bring electronics and recycle them. Maybe Sharon or someone else knows if there's a place up north here that does that. To my knowledge, I'm not sure of anywhere in Mason County right now that has an e-waste drop-off as a permanent location.
Yeah,
but it is something that the state is working on. And perhaps, Sharon, do you have an input on that?
No, I think I did forget to cover on our website, on a few's website, there is if you go to recycling, there is a list of all of the businesses in the area that would accept odd things like that, such as batteries. I don't know if there is a computer. But you can get to that. I had a slide on it and I skipped right over it, but it's listed by material. So you can look for batteries or computers. But also, as Matt said, a few has a household hazardous waste collection day in August. And I know that there's questions about glass and people are upset about glass, and they used to be able to thank you. So yeah, there it is. So if you just go right there, so this is just a screenshot, but you can scroll down and find, see if there's some place that will take a local item, to take a specific item. But one of the things I want to say, we miss glass because we had it, and I'll let Matt talk a little bit more about why the market just isn't there and the cost is just too high to handle it. But you know, there's so many other things you can do to compensate. So I this is a little vicious, I guess, but quit grieving over glass and find something else you can do in the area of waste reduction to compensate. So it's a toughie, but it's glass in a landfill is not the most dangerous thing. It's certainly not the best thing to do with your garbage, but you can find other ways to benefit the environment, even in the absence of glass recycling.
Thank you for that.
Get
So,
over it.
yeah, wow.
Ooh, that was tough.
That was way more aggressive than I would have been. So plastic caps can, of course, stay on top of plastic bottles. That's actually the preferred way to do it. Flatten your plastic bottles when you can. Leave the cap on there. When a mill processes plastic, they shred that plastic and then they put it in what's called a float tank. Heavier plastics sink, lighter plastics float, and they skim those two plastics apart. So even if a cap's a different type of plastic, which it likely is most times than the bottle, those things can be separated. So yes, please leave your caps on the bottles when you can. It definitely helps. Let me kind of keep on going through here. So there's a bunch of questions here on glass. So I'll talk about the markets of the glass real quick. So in our area, there's two places that glass can be processed. One is in Chicagoland and one is in Toledo. And so the transportation for glass is just like dirt and sand, because glass is a very dense and heavy material. And so the transportation cost for that is very high. The processing facility that we use currently takes that glass and actually uses it for covering at the landfill. It's called alternative daily cover. And so my opinion, just like before when we talked about the Happy Light and the fact that if you throw it away to start with, it costs $50. And if you send it through your recycling container, it costs $170 to make it ultimately end up in the same place. I kind of feel that way on glass. Now, does the facility take glass and process it? Yes, they do, but it ultimately ends up as a beneficial reuse. It does not become another bottle. And so it's being used as an alternative daily cover or perhaps a road base at best. And so that's why we've kind of leaned down on glass a little bit in Mason County. If you throw glass in your recycle center, it's not the end of the world. It's not going to break the equipment. It's not going to jam up the things. But, you know, ultimately glass does, when it breaks, impregnates into the cardboard and reduces the value of cardboard. Glass is an abrasive. So glass is very hard on the equipment that processes everything. It's like running sand or dirt through it. It makes the belts and the other equipment tear down and do that. So that's kind of the quick answer on glass. If you want to put glass in your recycle bin, know that that's likely the two sources that it's going to actually end up as. It's not going to become a new glass bottle. It's going to be either used for alternative daily cover at a landfill style facility, or perhaps road base at a landfill style facility. But that would be about the best use of it. So the glass itself does not have a negative impact in a landfill like plastics does. Again, it came from the earth, it goes back to the earth. And so that's just my personal opinion, and that's what I like to educate on glass when people ask.
You're doing something better for the environment if you're keeping batteries and household hazardous waste out of your garbage and get the guilt of putting glass in your, that's how you can get over the guilt of putting glass in your garbage.
Right.
Is make sure you're handling your household hazardous waste properly. And we're going to talk a little bit about waste reduction too. Yep. Which is important.
And so Dan said a great thing here. He said, you know, it's so much better to buy beverages in cans. And it honestly is. So a can, from the time you drink it to the time it becomes a can again, is likely 45 days. So by the time you buy it from the shelf, drink it, and it comes back to the shelf of the beverage in again in Michigan, is about 45 days. So yeah, cans are phenomenal. I'm a big
Yeah.
box wine person because I'm cheap. No, I'm just kidding. Let's just joke there. That box wine's no good most of the times. So the lid on a metal can is very thin. Can it go through the recycling process, or should it be put in the squeeze, shut off kind of thing? I always recommend that you put your metal lids inside your can and flatten your can around it. Takes less space in your recycle bin, and it's better for the processing equipment. However, that eddy current is going to pick up anything that's metal. It's going to suck it up and it's going to shoot it off into the metal bin. So your metal lid is going to be there. But a certain percentage of those do fall through the fines. In a recycling facility, the fines are examined. And if there's too much good stuff in the fines, they push that pile back into the main pile again and they run it all again. So it just depends on how that facility is operating at that point in time and kind of how that looks. So Sharon also wanted to talk a little bit about beneficial reuse and waste diversion. And so I'll touch on that real quick, and then I'll let her take a swing at it as well. Beneficial reuse means if it's something that has value or can still be used, can you find someone else that wants that, either by selling that through one of the Facebook marketplaces or Craigslist, or sending it to a donation place or things like that. Pop cans are the same way. In Michigan, a lot of people who visit our area might have a second home and they don't want to recycle because they're just here for the weekend. They're just using a cottage or a cabin. There's a lot of places across our region that you can donate those cans to nonprofits if you find those. And I'm sure a few can tell you where to do that. My wife recently found one that she likes, but I don't want to give bias to anyone, so I won't make a recommendation. So you can bring those to different places. A lot of churches, a lot of youth groups, a lot of sports teams, and other ministries and nonprofits a lot of times have that. So that's kind of the reuse of stuff. Waste diversion is really about buying less or buying more in non-packaged materials. So instead of buying a flat of water bottles, to buy a gallon of water. That's an easy example of waste diversion. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to waste diversion. Composting is a waste diversion mechanism that a lot of people use. We talked earlier about shredded paper going into compost. It's a great product in compost. It breaks down real well and it adds some value back into the compost. So you can do those kind of things. There's a lot of people that are doing, household chickens nowadays. And so, I was just at my in-laws' house the other day, and I bet you they had 60 egg cartons stacked up in the basement that they were going to give to someone who has a chicken farm. And so there's things that you can do to send those things down the road as well. So when you start talking about, waste diversion and beneficial resources, that's kind of the broad brush on it. And Sharon, you're more than welcome to throw some in there as well.
Yeah, there was a slide I think I had that just lists some ideas on waste reduction and reuse, because we often talk about recycling, but we should still focus as much as we can on reducing the amount of waste, whether even again, as Matt has mentioned, it costs money. It's costing all of us money to manage recyclables. It costs us money to manage solid waste. So think about waste reduction as much as you can. And it's,
I forgot that slide at the end. There you go.
That's all right.
There it is.
You know what? And you don't have to do all of these things, just find some of them. One of the things, I was working for a very little bit of time at the ShopRite. And I actually tried this. It went over like a lead balloon. If somebody had one thing, I said, you don't need a bag for that, right? Oh, yeah, I do. I'm thinking, really? You can't take your coffee cake out in the car and just put it on the seat next to you? But I do that all the time. Especially now with COVID, since we can't use the reusable shopping bags, or because we're all doing curbside pickup. So, I always try as much as I can. I don't need a bag, thank you. I get, even before they put it in the bag, I try to take it out of their hands so that I don't have to throw it out. Use reusable storage containers, or reuse your bags. Who I remember as a kid, the kid next to me at lunch, whose sandwich was always in a bread bag. And little did I know that they were early adopters of the idea of reuse. The amount of bags we throw out that can be reused. I don't know if you guys know the magic of using a magnet to dry your Ziploc baggies if you wash them out and you put them on the refrigerator with a magnet. Really great way to dry them. Use washable dishcloths rather than paper towels. I don't know if anybody has used these Swedish cloths. You can get them at Hallmark store. They're called Wet It, or there's different manufacturers. They work like as a sponge. They don't have any odor. I probably go through a roll of paper towel every 3 months because I use these instead. So these are all just some ideas. And then my favorite, is channel your grandmother, carry a hanky. I hike and bike, and I always stuff tissue in my pocket because you're always sniffling if you're doing that in the spring or fall. I'd always lose the tissue somewhere along the walk. So not only was I, I was also littering. So now I just clip a hanky to my jacket. I use a bandana. So you don't have to do all of these things, but find the 1 or 2 things that work for you in order to do reduction and keep it from even going into that recycling stream or that waste stream.
So Christine Hall asks, so is it better to leave the lids partially on the cans? Absolutely. That's a great way to keep it. But yeah, we said earlier, plastic bags, you can always take those plastic bags back to Myers or Walmart or Target stores. All those big box stores have a recycle bag drop-off area. But again, as Sharon said, Myers and Walmart and those guys don't really want.
There he goes again.
And I'm back. Look at that.
Yeah.
Power of Memorex. It's interesting. Wish I could
Well,
figure out
the
why that's there.
the retailers fought the bottle bill like crazy. I mean, if you go back to the early days of, they were certain it was going to ruin them as businesses in terms of having to deal with waste. They didn't want to deal with it. They've gotten so much better now, but in the early years, they had to figure out how to take all these bottles back and handle them. And so it's not their business. I don't know if you know, Matt, do they have a market for those recycled bags, or are they taking that really as a convenience to their customers?
So they're taking it as a convenience to their customers. There is a market that it goes to, depending on where you are, nationally or regionally. Some of that material goes into incineration, so it becomes a biofuel versus coming back as a plastic. Some of that material becomes, plastic decking, like Trex decking and things like that. So those are the 2 common uses for plastic bags. It's either biofuel or a substrate plastic, sawdust kind of engineered product of some degree. The other question was, can you recycle aluminum foil? Typically not, because aluminum foil typically has food stuck to it. There are people that do recycle aluminum foil. They wad it up as a ball because it is, magnetic, and so it does suck up to the current processes. So you can do that if you make it more tangible. If you leave it flat, it'll likely be interpreted as paper in the sorting machines and have to be picked out and thrown out as garbage. But it does have to be non-food based. You can't have any food on it. Yes, Sharon.
Who grew up in a household where you had to wash the aluminum foil and reuse it? Yeah. Who remembers begging their mother to buy a new roll of aluminum foil, and she's like, no, piece together the ones in the drawer, it'll work.
Christine talked about meds. So most of your pharmacies will take meds back. Stronger meds, tranquilizers, opioids are things that you don't want to mess with. Almost all police departments across the United States have a drug take back bin in them. I strongly encourage anyone who has opioids in their house, perhaps someone has passed away and they were on a stronger pharmaceutical, to take that material and get it out of your house. Don't flush it. Putting it into the water supply through the wastewater sanitation process is not a great way to do it. Some people do throw it away still. I always recommend, if you're going to throw it away, don't do it in the bottle and mix it with something else. But yeah, at the household hazardous waste days, sometimes they do the medical take backs as well. But most of your larger pharmacies will take that back, and your smaller pharmacies as well, and they'll recycle that or dispose of it properly for you. Those used pharmaceuticals typically go to an incinerator is how they get disposed of, so they don't get into the wrong hands. So that's a great thing. Mason County and Manistee County kind of partner for their HHW days. It's a county-based program. A few does do a great job of promoting and sponsoring it throughout the community. So there is that. Is there any way we can get a copy of your electronic slides? As Ms. Kane said, that will be on the YouTube channel, and that would be the way that that would be available. If there's any other questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them, or Sharon. And other than that, we're getting close to time. And so I want to be respectful of your time as always, folks. And I appreciate each and every one of you being here. At one point we had 20, we're down to 17. So I obviously made a couple people fall asleep and they logged off, but the most of you stayed here, and I really appreciate you taking time for me tonight and giving me a chance to give you a little bit of education on the kind of global big picture of recycling.
And I want to reiterate something Matt said early on, which is I think really important, is I talked about the fact that there is legislation pending. It would change the responsibility. It would renew each county's responsibility to do solid waste planning, materials management planning. And that's a decision point for every county in the state, if that passes, to re-examine their goals and their programs. And government's going to provide the services that you ask for. So that's something that, again, we as residents and we as an organization within a few will be looking at that. And if we do new planning, solid waste management planning, materials management planning in Mason County, to make sure that we look at having the best possible recycling programs we can for our area of the state.
Yeah, that legislation is important. So the Part 115 legislation was originally, that's current today, was originally kicked back in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was 100% focused on solid waste. And what it was really geared towards in Michigan was getting rid of all these small little unlined landfills and farmers' fields and little dinky townships and all of these little, what I would call non-regulated facilities. To own and operate a landfill in the state of Michigan takes a ton of engineering and a ton of cost in terms of what's required to make that durable within our society for today and for the future. And that's what Part 115 has been for the last 25 years, 30 years. And that's pretty well solved here in Michigan. We don't have landfills and farmer fields anymore. So Part 115 is being rethought, and it's really talking about waste diversion and recycling and those kind of products. So you're absolutely right, Sharon. It's a great thing to do.
We have one other question, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Since you ended, what about postal bags, part plastic and part paper?
Yeah, that's can't go in your traditional recycling, but yeah, there are people that claim that you can ship that stuff back to Amazon. But yeah, if it's a combined product, like you find some postal bags that have like an insulation to them, like a shredded paper or a felting or something on the inside of it, that typically is not recyclable through the system. You know, that's much better than the half plastic, half paper. You see that a lot in like dog food. You've got a plastic insert on side of a paper bag. So it's actually two products. It's not one product. It's complicated. It really is. Like I said, you know, you go back to the 70s, there was 10 things. You know, those 10 things were recyclable, and that's kind of how that worked. And in today's world, you know, there's a lot more things to consider when you start talking about that. And here's my magic trick for the day. I just made the garbage trucks disappear.
Oh, so, good. Oh, you can do that. Good work.
I can do magic, folks. Just watch.
All right. Well, then I think we're ready to sign off. Oh, so one last question, Matt. Heavy pet food bags. Again, it's going to depend on whether it's
plastic. It's going to depend about the material. Yeah. Again, if it has a paperish outlook on the outside, and if you separate the layers and you see that there's plastic on the inside, those typically are not recyclable because they are a multi-layered product.
Yeah.
And I have one last question also. Are you basically saying that if we don't know that it's recyclable, it's better to not put it in recycling than put it in?
Absolutely.
Just like my Happy Light example, it becomes unhappy when you put it in the recycling bin and it doesn't belong there. So when in doubt, my preference is either ask, seek knowledge, or
Okay.
make it go the other way.
All right, that's important to know that we shouldn't just throw it in just in case it is.
Yep. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're really increasing the cost of everything. So.
Okay. Well, thank
All
you
right.
so much, both Sharon and Matt, for a very interesting and informative presentation tonight, and we'll have it on YouTube.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.